A couple months ago, by the way, this is going to be my normal voice for the next 45 minutes to 60 minutes, so I hope you're used to it. Hold on a second. I thought I could really nail those first couple words. A couple years ago, I think we went through our study on Ecclesiastes, and one of my favorite verses from Ecclesiastes is found in chapter 1 and verse 9. Where Solomon writes, there is nothing new under the sun. This is kind of a repeating theme that he makes mention of several times, where he talks about there's nothing really new. If you think you've developed something new in today's world, somebody probably developed it 2,000 years ago. Please keep the giggles to a minimum, Brad. Somebody has developed it many, many years ago. And I think you see that more and more as you hear about theologies and doctrines developing. And there's a doctrine that's developed recently, I say recently within the past 50, 60, 100 years, called millennialism, or millenarianism, or chiliasm, whatever you want to call it. And it all has to do with this idea of a 1,000-year reign of Christ. And it seems very new, it seems very sensational. But I think when you look at the text, or I think when you look at history, you see that this idea has been around for a long time. In case you didn't know, this is going to be a very short sermon. There's an exchange between two men, one named Trypho and the other one named Justin Martyr, both of which existed around the 2nd, 3rd century. And they have this exchange where Trypho talks to Justin Martyr, and he asks him about this very idea of millenarianism. He says, but tell me, do you really admit that this place, Jerusalem, shall be rebuilt? And do you expect your people to be gathered together and make joyful with Christ and the patriarchs and the prophets, both the men of our nations and other proselytes who joined them before your Christ came? And this is a very common idea. It was a common idea before Jesus came. It's a common idea after Jesus came. And what Trypho is doing is he's asking, in a sense, do you believe in some kind of millenarian theory, some kind of premillennialism? And Justin Martyr, who has a fantastic amount of material on a whole bunch of different things, says very simply right after that, he says, I admit it to you formally that I and many others are of this opinion and believe that such will take place. I and others who are right-minded Christians on all points are assured that there will be a resurrection of the dead and 1,000 years in Jerusalem, which will then be built, adorned, and enlarged. The prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah and others declare. We're going to talk about that here in just seconds. But essentially what Justin Martyr is arguing is not only do I think that there's going to be a 1,000-year reign of Christ, I think Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt. I think that Ezekiel and Isaiah prophesied about this idyllic time. I think there's going to be a resurrection of the dead. I believe what Justin Martyr is saying in the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And ironically, if you look back at the history of that time period, this is not an uncommon idea. It wouldn't be until the time of Augustine, which would be about 300, 400 AD, that people started having different types of ideas. Maybe it's not about this premillennial theory, postmillennial theory. Maybe it's what Augustine called amillennial. And basically, when you talk about any kind of millennial theory, no matter if you're talking about premillennialism, postmillennialism, this idea has been around for a long time. And you've probably seen it popularized in recent media and things such as the fantastically horrible Left Behind series. By the way, not only did they have one movie about the Left Behind, which starred, I think, Kirk Cameron, they made a second one with Oscar-winning Nicolas Cage, and that Oscar came about 30 years before he starred in that movie. They also have a video game, as you can tell there. Left Behind would be the Kirk Cameron movie, that one, and Left Behind the video game, which promises that the smiting of the Holy Spirit is more powerful than bazookas. And so the idea of millennial theory is not anything new, even though it's been more or less popularized in recent years. And so the question comes when you talk about any kind of millennial theory, what are the things that are supposed to happen? And whether you're talking about premillennialism, postmillennialism, or even to a certain extent amillennialism, there's always this kind of list of things. There's Christ descending, there's a tribulation, there's a reign of the Antichrist, the Armageddon, the rapture, the conversion of Jews, a mass conversion of Jews, a throne judgment scene, Satan loosed, and then you have the millennium itself. And so the question always is, at what point do these various events happen? And if you're talking about premillennialism, the context is very clear that the second coming comes before a millennial reign of Christ. Postmillennialism, the second coming comes after the millennium. I'm going to be drinking a lot of this today. Also shout out to Ozzy for bringing me this. You also have amillennialism, which is a form, if you can call it that, of postmillennialism, but which believes that there's not a literal millennial reign of Christ, but that's more or less some kind of metaphor. That chart that is immediately below that is where you see all the different events that are supposed to take place that we had on the last slide. All those events are supposed to take place. And you're talking about the rapture, this millennial reign, the descension of Christ, the mass conversion of the Jews. A premillennial timeline is that easy to decipher. A postmillennial timeline is just as hard to decipher. And amillennialism, I would disagree with to a certain extent, but it also has its issues. And so the problem that I have with not just premillennialism or postmillennialism or even amillennialism is not unique to either one of them. They all have their unique failings, but they all share some very, very similar failings. First and foremost, in my opinion, the fact that it confuses the last days. I want you to look at Isaiah chapter 2 with me. Isaiah chapter 2. It's mornings like this that I wish I had some guy that just stood here that read all the passages for me, that I could just kick it over to him. Look at Isaiah chapter 2, starting in verse 1. I'll read a couple verses out of this. And this is a very well-known prophecy. It's something that the Jews would have understood very well in Jesus' time. He says, the word which Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem, it will come about, and here's that phrase, in the last days, that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills. All the nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So Isaiah chapter 2 talks about this very specific idea of there being some kind of last days. And Hosea chapter 3 and verse 5 talks about this same principle, that there's going to be a period known as the last days that is a virtual idyllic period, that is basically utopia, where everybody's happy, where Christ is back, he's reigning on his throne, and where everybody is obedient towards God. All these things are taking place. And I would argue too that that's the timeline, that's the thing that the Jews are looking for at the time of Jesus. When Jesus came preaching this idea of a metaphorical or a spiritual kingdom, rather, that's not metaphorical, but a spiritual kingdom, that was why they kicked so hard against it, was because passages like Isaiah chapter 2 and Hosea chapter 3 preach about this very definitive idea of idyllic last days. The problem is, when you get to Acts the 2nd chapter, in Acts chapter 2 and verse 17, Peter quotes from this idea, or quotes from Joel chapter 2, a passage that references the last days. And then 14 verses later, he says, these are the days that you're living in, where the Spirit pours forth on all mankind, where it comes down on everybody. These are the days that you're living in. And so at the very least, when you talk about the last days, whether you're looking at Isaiah 2, whether you're looking at Hosea chapter 3, you have to acknowledge that in some form we are living currently in the last days. And this is something that Hebrews 1 talks about. Look at Hebrews chapter 1. The Hebrew writer opens up his long letter talking about this same idea. Hebrews chapter 1, starting in verse 1. Hebrews chapter 1, starting in verse 1. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son. There's that key phrase. Whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world. He is the radiance of his glory, the exact representation of his nature, and he also upholds all things by the word of his power. And when he made purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. Did you notice what the Hebrew writer says there in Hebrews chapter 1? He says there in verse 2, or chapter 1 and verse 2, in these last days. That's what the Hebrew writer is at least insistent upon in his letter, is that we are currently living in these last days. That's something that James talks about. We'll look at this one more before we make an application. Look at James chapter 5. In James chapter 5, James has a word of exhortation that he gives towards the people. And he uses this exact same type of phrase. And James, the 5th chapter, starting in verse 1. Where James writes, "Come now, you rich, you weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, your garments have become moth-eaten, your gold and your silver have rusted, and the rust will be a witness against you and will consume you like fire. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure." He's talking about something that is very current, something that is very present amongst them. "Behold," verse 4, "the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields, which has been withheld by you, cries out against you, and the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth." The way that James talks about the last days is not as something that's future, not as something that's way far off, but as something that they are doing in the here and now. And so when millennial theories come around with this idea of last days, and they say it's going to be in the future, they negate the idea that literally all the New Testament people talked about it, at least in a general sense, of something we are going through right now. And that is one of the biggest issues I have with this idea of millennial theories, is that it confuses terms. And this is more than just an issue of semantics. If we say, well, this isn't the last days, those are the last days, then we have to at least acknowledge that according to Hebrews chapter 1, God is not speaking to us through his Son in these last days. That the Bible is not relevant in these last days, because after all, that's something in the future. And so if you're going to acknowledge that the last days are not here, then you have to take all the things that happen in the last days as not being here either. That's one of the biggest issues I have with it. But it's not the biggest issue I have with it. Another issue I have with it is that it denies the land promise. I'm not used to slowing down or taking breaks, so this is very awkward for me. It also denies the land promise. May 14th, 1948, one of the biggest events in geopolitical history took place. And that is, for the first time in 2,500 years, 3,000 plus years, Israel officially became a state. And it was around that time that people just started going haywire. Right after World War II, that was a really big issue that a lot of political leaders were really leaning towards, but they wanted their own state. Finally became one. And that mixed with the new media that was happening around that time. Newspapers were old media, but radio and TV, those things were big. And so this fact that all of a sudden Israel was a state again was huge in the minds of a lot of people, because they argue now, according to millennial theories, now Jesus can come back. And that's not too far off of a concept. When you look at what we talked about in the book of Genesis chapter 13, where he describes the idea that the land is going to be given to you forever, the issue then is, in a lot of people's minds, well, why was it gone? And if it's gone in the first place, it's eventually going to come back. Because after all, doesn't Isaiah talk about that? That I'm going to bring you from the nations and I'm going to gather you into one land. That's what people argue about it. Of course, when they argue that, they forget passages like Joshua 21. Look at Joshua 21. Joshua chapter 21. This is way after they've conquered Canaan, or at least most of it. And Joshua 21, look in verse 43. The fulfillment of that promise from Genesis 13 happens. Joshua chapter 21, starting verse 43, the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they possessed it and lived in it. That promise that was made in Genesis chapter 13, according to Joshua 21, was fulfilled. Verse 44, the Lord gave them rest on every side, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. No one of all their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand, and not one of those, verse 45, not one of those good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All of them came to pass. That's one of the biggest points I want to drive home, not only in this, but in every part of this lesson. God did not fail in his promises. Now, somebody would argue with this. They would say, well, of course, he gave the land to them there in Joshua chapter 21. He gave them it through the entire book of Joshua. But what about the exile? Because I will tell you right now, it was not their land in the exile. And even when it came back, it was not their land then, because it went straight from the Babylonians to the Persians to the Greeks to the Ptolemies to the Romans. It passed through a series of basically ownership. And that's what Israel was for the last 3,000 plus years, was occupied by other owners. And so the question is, how could God's promise not fail if Israel doesn't own the land now? And the answer is in chapter 23. What two chapters are past? Joshua chapter 23, starting in verse 8. Joshua chapter 23, starting in verse 8. He says, "But you are to cling to the Lord your God as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out great and strong nations from before you, and as for you, no man has stood before you to this day. But one of your men puts to flight 1,000. For the Lord your God is he who fights for you, just as he has promised you. So take diligent heed to yourselves to love the Lord your God." That's the background of this massive promise. "Seek ye this day whom you'll serve," or choose you this day whom you'll serve. This all leads up to that. But look in verse 12. "For if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, these which remain among you, and intermarry with them, so that you associate with them and they with you, know with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you, but they will be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you." God fulfilled the land promise. You see that taking place throughout the entirety of the book of Joshua. You see Joshua himself making mention of it. But there's a caveat in chapter 23. If you don't obey me, if you don't obey God, God is going to increase, or he's going to allow those people around you to be a thorn in your side, eventually to the point that they drive you right off the land. So people who are arguing that premillennial theories, that God is going to gather people back to Israel, newsflash, God's already done it. He fulfilled that promise in Genesis chapter 13. Look in Jeremiah chapter 23. Jeremiah chapter 23. This is an exilic book, or rather a pre-exilic book, right before the exile takes place. And in Jeremiah chapter 23, starting in verse 3. Jeremiah chapter 23, starting in verse 3. Jeremiah acknowledges that he is scattered, that God has scattered his people. Verse 3, he says, "Then I myself will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries which I've driven them, bring them back to their pasture. They will be fruitful and they will multiply. I will also raise up shepherds over them. They will tend them. They will not be afraid any longer, nor be terrified, nor will any be missing, declares the Lord. Behold," verse 5, "the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and act wisely, and do justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely, and this is his name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness." Verse 7, "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when they will no longer say, as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought back and led back the descendants of the household of Israel from the northland and from all the countries where I've driven them. Then they will live on their own soil." People will look at that and they say, well, what this is, when you look at these two together, is that you have this future ingathering of Israel, but you also have a king. "I will split, or I will take from David a righteous branch who will rise up as king." And so when you look at this on the surface, I will tell you right now that physically that was fulfilled. God did gather those people back towards Israel. And Nehemiah chapter 9 and verse 8 makes plain mention of that he has fulfilled his promise to bring those people back from exile. But then when he talks about the righteous branch, the king, we understand that as being Jesus. That it's not Jesus sitting on a physical throne, which they tried to make him do over and over and over again. If you don't think for 1 second that all of his followers would have picked up swords and stormed Jerusalem to establish him as king, you are dead wrong. They were all ready for that. Jesus rejected that because that's not the king that he was, and that's not the king that he is. And so physically they were gathered back to Israel. But spiritually Jesus is sitting on the throne. And so people who say, well, you have to have the land before you can have Jesus come back, that's not the case. But that caused the big uproar in 1948 when people started flocking back to Israel in mass droves. So one of my issues with it is it denies the land promise. But that's not my biggest issue with millennial theories. Another big issue that I have is that it reduces the church. One of the saddest things about this entire story about the millennial theories is how little people who believe it think about the church. In Ephesians chapter 3 and verses 4 through 11, I won't take time to read it right now for obvious reasons. But if you look at Ephesians chapter 3 verses 4 through 11, you cannot deny the love that Paul has for the church. And yet what many millennialists will say is that the church that we know and love now is not really what God purposed to happen. And they use the word specifically parentheses. And they'll delineate between the church age and the kingdom age. And they'll say what we're doing right now is living in the church age, but the kingdom age, ladies and gentlemen, that's to come eventually. And what we're living in right now is this kind of parentheses. And this was popularized in the last 100 years by a man named Scofield. Scofield had a Bible that was released right around World War I, where it was one of the first of its kind. The Geneva Bible did this a little bit, but they hadn't done it really since. But the Scofield Bible took the Bible and put his notes alongside of it. And it was one of those Bibles that was used by seminarians in the First World War, that post-World War, World War II era. So a lot of people were reading that Bible and also reading the Scofield notes. And the Scofield notes that went alongside it were blatantly Zionist, blatantly millenarian. As a matter of fact, this is what he says. In Matthew chapter 21, he says, the kingdom of heaven announced, this is his exact quote, the kingdom of heaven announced as at hand by John the Baptist, by the king himself and by the 12, and attested by mighty works, was morally rejected. The final rejection is later. Did you pick up on what he says? What Scofield argues for in this passage, is that Jesus tried to come to establish the kingdom, and it was rejected by his people. And so when the kingdom was rejected, what God did was he set up the church until the kingdom could be established, which goes against every part of New Testament teaching. Goes against every idea. When Jesus is on the cross and he says, it is finished, what is he talking about? If not about the work that he came here to do. If not about the work that he was sent to do. If it wasn't finished, then what's that about? You can hear my voice hit the upper register, so I'm going to take a drink. When you look in Daniel 2, for instance, you don't have to right now. Most of us are familiar with the story in Daniel 2 where Nebuchadnezzar has this massive dream with all these different layers. And all these 4 layers represent different kingdoms. And then a stone comes out of nowhere and crushes it, and it's established. And then the prophecy that Daniel brings up in Daniel chapter 2, he says, in the days of this last kingdom, a kingdom will be established that will reign forever. The Roman Empire fell in the 5th century A.D. Charlemagne tried to bring it back up in the 9th century A.D. That was a somewhat up and down little motion. So success, and then it went sharply downhill. But the Roman Empire is gone. And if, according to prophecy, the kingdom is going to be established in the Roman Empire, then that Roman Empire, that kingdom is 1,500 plus years late. When people talk about the kingdom and they talk about premillennial theories, it's not just semantics. The very argument of a kingdom age in the future reduces the church, ladies and gentlemen, that you and I love so much. But this isn't even the biggest issue I have with it. The 3 things that we've talked about are not the biggest issues I have with millennial theories. The biggest issue that I have with it, from a purely practical standpoint, is that it gives us, and it gives the world, false hope. If you and I believe that we are living in some kind of parentheses, that we're living in some kind of church age that will be replaced later by a kingdom age, if that's what we truly believe, and there's multiple resurrections, and that's a part of the millennial theories. There's going to be a first resurrection, second resurrection. If you believe in that, then what it teaches us is that we have more time to obey the gospel than we realistically have. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus answers several questions. He talks about the coming of the kingdom. He talks about the second coming of Jesus. He talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. And he makes very plain in those first 20 so verses that when the destruction of Jerusalem happens, you need to flee to the hills. And there are going to be people who will say, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Don't listen to them. You will know it when you see it. But then he says in Matthew 24, verses 36 through 39, talking about the second coming of Jesus, nobody knows when that day is going to come. Nobody knows that day. Nobody knows that hour. Not even the Son of Man himself. And yet what millennial theories will teach you is that you don't need to worry about that coming. You don't need to worry about the great judgment scene, because once he comes the first time, there's still some time to get your life right before he comes a second time. And there are people walking around right now that don't have any incentive to get their life right. Because after all, why should they? If they believe in once saved, always saved, and faith only salvation, that's the absolute bare minimum that they need to do to be saved. And if they don't even do that, then there will be 1,000+ years that they can get their life right and eventually go to heaven. That's the problem that I have with this. You see, Satan doesn't have to convince us that God isn't real. Satan doesn't have to convince us that Jesus didn't die on the cross. Satan doesn't have to convince us that the scriptures are false. What he has to do is he has to teach us that we think we have more time than we actually do. That's the biggest issue I have with millennial theories. John chapter 17 and verse 4, Jesus says very simply, I glorified you on the earth, having accomplished the work which you have given me to do. Jesus believed when he was on the cross that he has accomplished everything that God had given him to do. And yet people in today's world will tell you that Jesus didn't accomplish it, that what he accomplished was plan B, or that what he accomplished was secondary to what he really needed to accomplish. That Jesus failed in some kind of way. And if that's what you believe, if that's what I believe, then our soul is in jeopardy. We need to understand that we don't have 1,000+ years. We may not even have, as was evidenced by the tornado, we may not even have another week to get our life right with God. And so if you're sitting here and you're apart from God, I want you to turn your life around right now and come back to him before it is too late. And I would love for you to do it now as we stand and as we sing.